started. I hate to be such a time Nazi, but when we have sessions one after another, we can't get behind, so we need to go ahead and start. I think we need to do this session often because we have an increasing number of international students, and many of them do not come with English as their first language, and they're all along a continuum of their mastery of English. And only the very, very elite have mastered academic English, which is what we ask of them when they come to our classes. So all our students have a learning curve to learn the vocabulary of our discipline. But if you're learning the vocabulary of the discipline and it's not even in your first language, and then you're asked to write papers and do research, it's a huge leap for them. So I ask our second language experts here to come and give us a little help in thinking about our students who don't come with perfect English skills. So David Broersma and Chris Blake, you may not know them because they're new within this decade, which to me is really super new. But they're both in teaching English to speakers of other languages. That's their area of specialization. And so they're the gurus of that major. And so dealing with non-native speakers is kind of their bread and butter. So they're going to give us some ideas.
Well, and I should say right off the bat that Dr. Carolyn Dirksen is also one of the professors in the TESOL department, so the three of us work together. And actually our TESOL major is only in its second year. We've had a minor for many years, but we've just had the major now for this is the second year, and we almost have 50 majors. We're getting close to that, and so we're excited about the growth that's happening there. And we are hopeful that one of the outcomes from this session will be that people actually know what TESOL stands for. I've given up on telling people that I'm a professor of TESOL. I just say linguistics now because nobody knows what it is. I mean, not here in Lee, most people at Lee know, but anyway. So we have the major and the minor, and I was just talking with someone the other day, and they were saying that there is a movement in many states in the U.S. these days to require all people who are getting certified to teach in schools to have a TESOL minor. And I know from talking with our recruiters here for the education department that it makes a huge difference for people if they're going out, even if they're math teachers or science teachers, if they have a TESOL minor, it makes them much more marketable. So this is kind of a growing field here at Lee and across the country. But we have been working in the last couple of years, more than even before, to try to think more clearly and more strategically about what we're doing to support international students here at Lee. And we've had numerous meetings and talked with different people, and actually in some respects we have had things in place in terms of our policies for admission and that kind of thing for some time that we haven't really been following through on in terms of making sure that people who need the help are getting into the at least the little bit of help that we do offer. So we're trying to make changes in that, and we're hoping that that will have some impact in the upcoming days and years. But basically right now we have one course for international students, which is English 090. There is a follow-up course to that 091, but up until recently that has mainly been just kind of remedial writing and not so much really an ESL focused class. And so we're kind of working on that right now, but at least English 090, which is offered every fall when we have the biggest influx of new international students, is something that students should be in if they are struggling with their English and it's their first semester. So if you know of any students that belong there and aren't there, make sure they get signed up. But as I said, we're trying to work on the system better to make sure that people get where they're supposed to be placed. But to begin with, Dr. Blake is going to give us some idea of kind of profiles of different students that we have at Lee that are international students.
Yeah, so on your handout here, you'll see at the top of the list, there are 47 different countries represented at Lee. And and I don't have the numbers for you of how many from each country. They exist out there somewhere, but at least I have this for you. And I think the number is around 200, that we have about 200 international students here at Lee from these 47 countries represented. The, one thing to keep in mind, it's helpful for me to realize, is that, not every face that we see on campus, we think, oh, that's an international student, is necessarily an international student. A lot of these students, born, raised, grew up in the United States, they just have a face that is the non-traditional white Caucasian face. So we don't want to lump all of these students in as international students, but I don't even think it's necessarily, I don't think international students is the best way to sort of, semantically, the best way to label the students who need help at Lee University. Because the truth is, we have students who are not international students. They have green cards here in the United States. They are residents, but they've grown up in homes where English is not their primary language. And so, if we just say, well, okay, so you're not an international student, so you don't need assistance, that's not the case. So really a better way to think of it when you start thinking about the students in your classes is, this is the question, when their family situation, when they're home, when they're not in school, what language do they speak? And so this is the way we handle it in the public schools. K-12, they're given a home language survey. Now I am of course not saying we do a home language survey, that we wouldn't want to go there, but public schools, the way they determine if somebody is an English language learner or if they need assistance is to ask them, what language do you speak at home? And so maybe think about it that way with your students. What is daily life like for them in language? Is it another language? Then very well, even if they grew up in the United States, they're American citizens, they might need more of the help that we're going to be talking about later today.
Is it still appropriate to say first language?
It is, yeah. It's going away somewhat because now we have so many individuals who it's not a first or a second, it's just another language for them. And so that, yeah. But that's a good question though, Chris. Yeah, we can still say first and second language, and I think that's the way most language learners still think of it. Still is, English is my first or it's a second language for me. But so anyway, but here's something to think about. You might not have thought about this before. Probably haven't. Braj Kachru, he's an Indian linguist, and in the 1960s he came out with really, I think it's elegantly brilliant. I mean, it's such a simple looking model, but it's such a great way of conceptualizing English around the world. And so this is really historically how English has grown around the world. We have the inner circle countries, and inner circle countries are countries where English has, think of it as it's always been there. English roots are in this country, always have been. So the U.S., the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And so we certainly have students. Some of these students on this list here at the top of the 47. Many of our students are from inner circle countries, and one way to think about this inner circle is those of us in the inner circle set the standard for everybody else. So we say, well, if you're not speaking like somebody from the inner circle, your English is strange, you need help, which isn't necessarily the case, as I'm going to say in a minute. We need to sort of back away from, and this is really the move in linguistics right now, is to back away from thinking of one standard, if you don't speak like the inner circle, well, then you don't speak much at all, or you don't speak well at all. So, but that's traditionally, this is the standard bearer for English in the inner circle. Then the outer circle, these countries in the outer circle are countries where English has been planted at some point or another, primarily through colonization. And so you see the list of countries here, and we certainly have students at Lee University who are outer circle countries. Who are from outer circle countries. I'm looking here, Kenya and Nigeria are mentioned as, by the way, this is not exhaustive at all, but I mean Kenya and Nigeria, India, Singapore, Sri Lanka. I think actually all of these have been represented at some time or another, or are currently represented here. But here's something I want you to know about the outer circle. Students from the outer circle countries. Your students from here may sound like they really don't know English very well. And that's because they speak a different variety of English, as we call it. They have vocabulary items that exist in their language which don't exist in ours. Just a quick example. I love this one from India. This is called, in India, what do we call this, by the way?
Keychain.
Keychain, right? It's called a key bunch. in India, and I love that, right? It's perfect. I mean, I want to call it a key bunch, you know. And so, the more you get to know students from the inner circle, the outer circle countries, the more you just appreciate. Wow, they have such a depth to their language, and they're so creative, and they really are. They have English was transplanted there, and then they made it their own in a creative sort of way. And so, think about your students from here. English is spoken there as a main language. It is one of their main languages in Nigeria. It's one of their main languages in Kenya. And think of context. In the outer circle, your students from these countries, when they go to apply for a document in their country, they're using English. When they go to the schools, they're using English in the schools. So English is used, they see it on street signs. They see it all over the place in these countries. So it's not like English is a foreign language at all for them. So then the question needs to come to your mind, well then why would some of my students from Nigeria be struggling in my class? Why would some of my students from Kenya be struggling in my class if English is spoken everywhere? Can you guess why? Why would they be struggling in your class if English is their language?
Lack of teachers?
Lack of teachers? Anybody else?
Colloquial English.
Colloquial English, right. So they have a different pronunciation. They have different vocabulary items. So the English that they are used to and the mannerisms in which they are used to hearing English, even down to gestures, like I'm gesturing right now, all of the, as we would call it, the pragmatics and the social linguistic, that area of linguistics, it's different for them. So they may struggle in your class, even though English is their main language. Now, can you imagine the embarrassment for them when they come here? They've always learned English. They've spoken it since they've been in first, second grade. They come here and now they're struggling because of their English. Well, are they going to go to you and get help? No, because that is a complete loss of face. Will they ever want to take a proficiency test to see how strong they are in English? No, it's like sending you. Can you imagine going overseas to Nigeria and someone says, "Wow, you sound odd. Like, you really speak English?" And like, "Do you need some special help?" You're like, "No, I have spoken English forever. I will not take your test. I will not get help." And that's sort of the way these students feel. So you want to think when you're working with them, you're going to employ the strategies that Dr. Broersma is going to be talking about, but you don't want to do so in such a way that makes them feel like they're getting special help from you because they lack English proficiency. You're trying to save their face, in other words. And I think we need to save everybody's face. But I mean, especially with the outer circle. Can you think of anything I haven't mentioned about the outer circle? So then the expanding circle. Okay, so this is where English was not transplanted. It's where English is, as it says, it's expanding into these countries right now. And it's really through, some call it the McDonaldization of English. But it's like, where there's a McDonald's, there's English now, pretty much. And so what's happening in these countries, China, Indonesia, Korea, these are countries that are all part of this global phenomenon, which we know is world English, which is English is now the lingua franca. It's when people go, you can have somebody from China and somebody from Korea doing business, guess what they speak? English, right? And they get by, and they find a way to get by. But these students in the expanding circle countries, their English is very different from your students from the outer circle countries. And you can imagine right away, you've worked with these students, what the differences are. Students in the outer circle countries, they're in class, they step out of class, what do they speak? English. What do they hear? English. They're using English all the time. Your students who are from expanding circle countries, they're in their English classroom in China. They step out, what do they hear? Chinese. They hear Chinese, they speak Chinese. So for them, skills like listening, traditionally skills like listening and speaking, they really, really struggle at. It's changing some now because of tests, and they're preparing really well for tests, and part of the backwash of test preparation is you actually become better at language. But anyway, these students struggle not so much with reading and writing, actually. I mean, they still do, but you might notice that for some of them, they read all right, but they're not, but with speaking and listening. So there's this mismatch, and I've gone through the same struggle myself. Like I've seen a student do well with one skill, like you might see a student who's speaking really, really well, but they're struggling with reading. Or you might see one who reads really well, like they keep up with all of your PowerPoints, they keep up with all of the notes that you give them, but then when you go to communicate, you're like, wow, can you understand me? And you're having difficulty determining where they are. That's very common with students from the expanding circle countries. Their skills across the board, there's some variation. It's not consistent. And so one other point I was going to make about, this. Be careful, because a lot of times, especially students from the expanding circle, because they save face as well, they will nod a lot in your classes, like they're understanding, because that's their coping mechanism, but just because they're nodding their heads does not mean they're tracking at all. So that's just one way of thinking about your students. One other way to think about them is culturally, how different all of these students are. When we talk about, just as when we were having the great discussion that we were a couple of days ago about working with students from different cultures and ethnic diversity, you cannot put any of them in the same place. Well, the same way with our students who are learning English. Just to give a quick example, I worked with one student who was from South America, Ruben. I'm trying to remember where he was from, but Ruben, I called him Ruben. He was the cello player.
Oh, he was in Paraguay.
Paraguay, thank you, Paraguay. He came here, viola. So anyway, that was several years ago. He came here knowing no English. Like, I don't know, did he know any English when he came here? It was so poor. I could not communicate with him, it seemed. But by the end of that semester, he was carrying on conversations. It seemed like he was hanging out with Americans. He just was like the life of every party I was at, right? And I didn't go to many parties, but I mean, every party. But so anyway, that was him, and that is, you hate to stereotype, but your students from that region of the world tend to be more outgoing. They tend to have more of that presence and that energy. And if you give them a little bit of English, they'll just run with it, right? And so those students, you're going to work differently with them in your classes than students, and I won't name names here, but I had a couple of students from Korea recently, about a year or two ago, and they would walk around campus holding hands, and then they'd sit down together in my office, and you could hardly hear what they were saying, and I just never knew whether I was being understood or not. And so, for some, it just seems some countries, the people tend to be more outgoing and gregarious and make use of every English opportunity. Others are more conservative in that respect, and so they all have different needs culturally. So I think that's the main thing I want to say. So
Great. So we're going to transition here to talking about specific strategies for working with English language learners, and you'll notice that a lot of these strategies are just good classroom strategies in general, not only for English language learners, but they're more important for English language learners. And there is a little bit of overlap here with the things we've been talking about diversity in general, just supporting students in the classroom. And the first point there is accessibility, and this is one we've talked about a lot. But making sure that they understand that you're serious about your office hours and giving them additional help if they need it. And trying to intervene more quickly if you notice that they're struggling. So, if you get off to the start in a classroom, and this is where I think the next point comes in as well, is doing some formative assessments really quickly and early and often, kind of in the classroom, so that you can see how are they doing, are they picking up on the material, are they managing in the class, and that kind of thing. And if they're not, then you have to be kind of proactive with many international students and actually say, I want to talk to you in my office, or can you meet me after class, and then have a conversation with them about the fact that you want to support them so that they can succeed, but in order for that to happen, they're going to have to be in communication with you about that. And this came up in the conversation this morning about one of the Nigerian students was commenting on the fact that with his professors, they still used corporal punishment, and that a student would never go get extra help from a professor or a teacher, and so there's still a very strong barrier to doing that kind of thing, and this is certainly true in cultures, Asian cultures in particular, where the teacher is supposed to know everything and you just do what the teacher tells you to do and then you're okay kind of thing. They do not relate relate to the teacher as a friend, you know, as somebody to come and get help from. You get help from your friends, your buddies, you know, and you assume that they know what's going on, but you would never go talk to the teacher. So you're overcoming kind of a cultural bias against working with an authority figure. And I think, you know, my experience has been that students at a place like Lee, this is one of the things that they find really exciting and invigorating about a Christian university, is that the professors really do mean it when they say they want to work with them. But it takes some time to overcome the barriers that are there, and it requires a little more effort on your part to get there with them, and to make sure that you really mean it when you're available in your office hours. You aren't just saying that because you're required to, but you really do want to help them and interact with them. And so I think that that's a helpful thing. Just a word about formative assessment. So a formative assessment is just a short exercise or something that reflects what you've been covering in class and gives them an opportunity to give themselves and you feedback about how well they've mastered the material that you've been covering. And so it can be, I mean, it can be anything. It can be a short quiz. It can be an opportunity to say something in class. There are lots of different possibilities for how you could do this, but just doing, like at the end of a class period from the last 10 minutes or something, just doing a quick kind of assessment, or even, you know, if you do it regularly every week or something like that, but gives you feedback on how well they're mastering the material. And then, you know, as soon as you see that they're starting to flounder, getting in touch with them right away so that they don't get too far behind.
Yeah, along with that, with K-12 students, there's something called exit cards, and it's so simple, but it's just you have your note cards or something, and you pass them out, and it could be your way of taking attendance. But they just write, tell me something you learned about blank today. And then if you get blank, then you know that they didn't, you know, learn much. So, it's just a great diagnostic. So, okay, 3, make use of as much visual, auditory, and kinesthetic support as possible. The more ways that material is reinforced, the easier it is going to be for ELLs to master it. So think of your English language learners. You know, they let's say somebody from China, for example. So they are going to be struggling to hear you. But can you imagine the difficulty of taking notes? So they're having difficulty with listening, but then taking notes at the same time. So the more tasks, the more layers we add, but it's not just listening and taking notes, right? It's actually cognitively processing what you're saying. So there's so much going on. And so at our task, what we do as professors is try to find, you know, multiple ways to get information to students. And so something that we tell all of our students in the TESOL program is really make use of the whiteboard. And it is so helpful. Even just think of when you prepare go over your notes this semester, look at what you're going to be teaching each day, look at your key terms, and then just highlight what key terms should I put on the board. But it's not always even the key terms. Be aware of other words like synthesize, analyze, evaluate, you know, words that we use more only in the classroom. Write those key words down on the board as you're using them. Colored markers can be helpful too, because you might get so many words going on the board, you might want to help break it up for them a little bit with different colors. That can be useful. PowerPoints can be a struggle, and can be, it sort of cuts both ways with PowerPoints as I see it. The good of PowerPoints is that you have material up there which you can put on Moodle so that students can go back to it again and review. I think that's what's great about PowerPoints. Where things go wrong is that PowerPoints, we tend to go quicker over PowerPoints, and so we present information in a way that is just not, that's faster than we usually would. Am I right on that? Would you all agree? At least that's the way I am. I mean, they're up there, they're going. We tend to put too much text on a PowerPoint, and so an English language learner has no, we're talking along, but they don't know where to focus with all of this text. So with your English language learners, it can be helpful to minimize the amount of text. And then one other just easy way to work with PowerPoints, and again, we tell our students this a lot, is when you're using them to go up and point to the keywords that you're using. So if you're on a certain section, point to that section that you're at, put your hand up there, use your laser pointer. But you would be amazed at how much students are not following your PowerPoints. And this is something that I think Dr. Broersma mentioned, but when you do this, it's good for all of our learners in our classroom. It's going to help just basically every single person out there, except for the person who was born in a classroom, right? Just raised there and then how to navigate it all. So that's one. Beware of the PowerPoints. A second one is, so write key terms on the board. Give handouts if relevant. And then, let's go down to number 4. Post copies of the syllabus in Moodle. Make PowerPoints available in Moodle. And here's another idea that I've started to use is when I have a lot written on the board, just take a snapshot of what you've written. You just pull out your camera and say, hey, let's take a picture of this. And it's a little awkward, but it's also kind of a moment. It's a down moment in the class. It can be helpful. But you just go up, you just take your pictures, and then you send it to your whatever, on your phone, and then put that up on Moodle. And then that's just another great way for students to get information. I've heard, and I don't know, I've heard that some professors just really do not want their lectures recorded. And it's something to think through. I had an international student who I was trying to assist, and I said, well, go make a tape recording of the lectures, because this student was not able to keep up with anything. And he said, no, my professor said, I cannot record anything, which I thought was unfortunate, but someone explained to me why that's the way it is. But then think through, okay, if that student, if my speaking to them is the only way, if auditory, them listening is the only way to get information, that's not good, right? What other ways can I use? And then that's when we think through taking a picture of what you've written on the board, writing key terms down.
Chris,
Yeah.
I've encouraged students to take out their phone and take a picture.
Yeah, that's good.
That way they have it for themselves too.
And again, like Dr. Broersma was mentioning, international students just do not want to do anything that would make them the center of attention in the class. And they are just so respectful of teachers. So you would really have to say, okay, everybody, let's do it. Come on, get out of your seats. Let's take the pictures. And eventually you get to the point where students do it. And it can be fun. I think it's a way of creating more of a safe, enjoyable learning environment rather than, something it shouldn't be.
Yeah, another thought about that too is that I've found that when I'm in the middle of a discussion in a class period and the class period ends, we're kind of doing it over a couple of days, that it's really helpful to take a picture of what's on the board, and then I can even make a handout from that if I want, or just give them the picture so that when we come back we can pick up where we left off and we don't have to start all over again putting everything up on the board. But I know for younger professors, it's probably like, well, duh, of course you do that. But for us old timers, this is still kind of a revelation that you could use your phone for such things. Anyway, schema activation. This is old, education 101, but just letting people know what it is you're talking about, or especially if you're going to be doing some kind of an assessment, kind of getting them back into the thing that they've been talking about. When you're a ELL, when you're an English language learner, and you're having to focus on so many different things, and so much of your processing ability is going to paying attention to what's going on, trying to understand it, you often can get just totally thrown if somebody starts talking about something out of the blue, and you don't have you're not in the right context. And so I've experienced this myself with Russian. Someone would come up to me and start talking about something that was decontextualized, it was not relevant to what we were experiencing at that moment, and they just got started on something and I was in the wrong place, and I just couldn't figure out what on earth they were talking about, because it just didn't seem to connect to anything that I was making sense out of. But if they just said one or two words to kind of orient me, I have a question about this topic, then I would be fine. I could understand everything they were saying. It just is just a simple educational principle. I understand that, but it's really important for ELLs that you don't just sort of make quick turns in the road, and suddenly shift from one topic to another that's unrelated without helping them to make that transition, or when you're starting something new or getting ready to test them on something, giving them a little bit of context to get them started and then going into it. The next one is, the next couple of them have to do with kind of creating an emotional environment that works for your international students. And this is a lot of what we've been talking about just in diversity in general, is trying to make the classroom a safe place, a place where students know that you respect them all as human beings, you care about what they think, this kind of thing, but that it's safe for somebody to answer a question or to ask a question without being made fun of. They international students, as a general rule, already feel like they have two heads, and that they're standing out all the time. And so they're very sensitive to any kind of situation where they might get laughed at, or, when they didn't intend to be laughed at, It's one thing if you're making a joke. It's another thing when you are the joke and you weren't expecting to be. So trying to create that kind of safe environment is important. And at Lee, I think as professors, we've had a lot more international experiences than most university professors have. So you may have experienced this yourself, but I can just say from my own experience, when you are living in a context where you have to pay attention to a different language all the time, it's not your native language, you have to get work accomplished, and you have to work about 4 times harder than anybody else to get that work accomplished, you are exhausted. I mean, like, fatigue is a real issue. And very often these students are staying up much later than their classmates because it takes them so much longer to do the work. And they're dealing with just the exhaustion that comes from just this exposure to new things all the time. So, very often these students are a little more emotionally fragile, especially in the beginning stages, than they would be in under normal circumstances. And so again, just kind of being conscious of that. If you see signs in the classroom that they're unraveling or something, just being aware of that so you can be a support to them. They can get the help or encouragement even if it can't come from you, finding somebody who can help them, process what they're going through, or, and in some cases it means, giving them a little bit of extra time on something because it's clear that they just aren't coping at the moment. And so just thinking in those kinds of terms, just being aware of it. And the reality is that my experience with international students has been that they are such hard workers, and they really are serious. They're really trying to make everything work. And, I think we're accustomed in classes as professors to thinking that if work is not being done, it's because the student is lazy or, has a poor work ethic or something like that. But with international students, that is so rarely the case. Now, there are cases. Every international student's a human being, and sometimes human beings do dumb things. But in my experience with international students, almost always, they are really working hard. And so you want to kind of, think in terms of rewarding that effort, I think, by giving them the benefit of the doubt and helping them when it's possible to help them. And I'm going to skip for a minute to number 11 on the handout because this fits in here. But we don't have any kind of official policy for making accommodations for international students here like we do for students with learning disabilities that have been documented. And so your international students aren't going to come to you with a list of the things that you should do to help them in the classroom. But you as individual professors have the possibility of making some accommodations as you see they are appropriate. And so this is where, you have to rely on the Holy Spirit a little bit and, your own intuitions and, compassion or whatever, to see if this is a student who's working hard and making an effort. It's not just an issue that they're not trying, but language is the key thing that is hindering them from being successful. Then sometimes you can give them a little bit more time to finish an assignment or an exam or something like that. So you can give them some kind of an accommodation. This is something that you can decide as a professor to do. And you just have to decide how you work that out. Now, there are cases, obviously, where timing is a part of the assessment. Where you have to be able to get a certain amount done in a certain amount of time. And, like the nursing exam kind of thing where they have to finish the test in the time given to them, and if they don't score well enough, it not only affects them, it affects the whole program. Excuse me. And so that is a real issue, and we had this conversation earlier. But I think in a situation like that, if you have students who are struggling initially, giving them a little bit longer time initially, but with the understanding that that amount of extra time was going to diminish quickly, you know, as they got used to doing this kind of evaluation, so that they have a little bit of time to work into it. I think that that's a good strategy. My experience has been with international students that by the time they get to their junior or senior year, very often they are doing way, way better than we ever dreamed they would be doing. And so we have to have a little bit of faith that God is going to make it possible for them to improve, you know, and it's scary at the beginning because you're thinking, if this person isn't going to make it, I need to make that call now so they don't waste their time, and that's a pressure. But in my experience, very often they do end up making it, even though they looked a little frightening at the beginning. So we're trying to kind of work with, you know, make whatever accommodations are possible in the early stages, and it's actually in the early stages where you're having the most trouble, and where you are going to have the most trouble, because they are still learning a lot. You know, just listening to, it's so interesting to me to listen to students who are like juniors or seniors that I knew when they were freshmen and they could barely make themselves understood as freshmen, and you know, all of a sudden they're sounding like, you know, American teenagers or something. You know, they've really mastered something that they didn't have mastery of just a few years before. So that, I mean, I think that's something that we have to kind of weigh, and I think there probably will be cases where you will have students who just really aren't going to make it, and there can be different reasons for that. But I think we need to work with them as much as possible, give them as much support as possible, and give them opportunities to prove themselves, you know, a little bit with a reasonable amount of time to work on something, you know, before they get to the big test and blow it, you know, kind of thing.
I'll jump in for 8 and 9 if you want. Or is that, were you up to there yet?
Pardon me?
Were you going to go? I'll jump in for 8 if you want
Oh,
to.
okay, go ahead.
Okay. But I didn't want to cut you off.
No, go ahead. I was ready to
Okay.
start something new.
Number 8 with the models of assignments and exams. You know, this is really true also with students who aren't even English language learners. But you know, so many of our students are like, how do you really want that to look? What do you want that paper to look like? And so, if you on Moodle would put your sample assignments, just if you have a student who did well on an assignment in the past, put that up on Moodle for them. A lot of our English language learners struggle with writing, especially because they've never seen what a 3-paragraph essay looks like with the introduction, you know, the 3 main points and the conclusion. So show some sample work, you know, chemistry or whatever it be. I can guess that we would all have some sample. What does a lab report look like? Have that up there, and that will help them tremendously when they're at home working on it. And then number 9, give adequate wait time. So a lot of international students will never raise their hand, will never respond because they just can't get their hand. And we all know what it's like to have that student who puts up their hand first. And international students will never ever be those to have their hand up first. So one idea is just to say to everybody, here's what we're going to do in this class. I'll throw out a question. I give them 15 seconds wait. You jot down your answers on a card or something like that. Get your ideas down. And a lot of times just that getting that on a card and jotting down a few ideas is enough support for that international student to be able to then launch out and give an answer. Just so giving 15 seconds, or you might have them collaborate. So they write down their answers and they could talk to somebody and then let them share out. And then number 10, the buddy system can work really well with our English language learners. So if you know somebody in your class who likes to work with other people, you could just partner your English language learners up. Let them buddy up.
Yeah, we've actually covered most of the items on here. The big one that we haven't talked about is taking advantage of what is offered by the university. And Luan and her office and academic support, they have, I've really had wonderful experiences with my students working with tutors for different classes, and international students are going to be hesitant to do this initially, to ask for a tutor for something. And there are several reasons for it. One is they don't want to lose face and have to admit that they need help in a public sort of way, and that's what it feels like to them. But another reason is that in many cases they're struggling with time as it is, because it's taking them so much longer to do all of their assignments, that the thought of adding in another meeting to do something can be kind of overwhelming. But I think this is where we can come in if we're asking them to get tutoring and say, look, if you get somebody who's able to talk through things with you, it's likely that it's going to take you a lot less to get the homework done. So it's probably worth the investment of spending that time with a tutor so that you can actually do better. And the tutor, not all of the tutors are trained to work with international students, and there may be some cases where they just get somebody who doesn't know what to do with them. If that's the case, I'm sure, they could come back to Luan and talk about it. But in most cases, just having somebody who's willing to listen with them and repeat something that the teacher said and kind of explain it in different words and paraphrase things will be enough to get them over the hump. So I think it's really worth taking advantage of that. The other main opportunity that I would mention is the Writing Center. And students can sign up for appointments at the Writing Center. It's not online at the moment, but will be very soon in time for them whenever they would need it. But when they go to make appointments for the Writing Center, they actually have a list of all the tutors there with a short bio of each one. And many of the students are TESOL minors at least, even some TESOL majors. And so they have some experience of working with international students. And even those who aren't TESOL minors or majors get training in working with international students as a big part of their training for preparation for working in the Writing Center. So they have that kind of background to work with students. So it really is a good possibility for them. If they're struggling with a writing assignment, they're not doing well, it would be great for them to spend some time in the Writing Center with somebody who could walk through things with them a little bit. All right, those are the points that we wanted to make, and we just have a few minutes left, but we wanted to give you an opportunity to ask questions or talk about any experiences that you've had that, or things you've learned in dealing with international students. Yeah.
So, I wish I would have had this session many years ago. I taught overseas for a couple of years, and I think one of the many things that I learned much later in the process than I had wished was not only just the verbal language part, but I was teaching a school where I had students from a lot of different countries in Asia and Oceania. So the cultural part of their educational background, some students come from a background where everything had been strictly rote teaching. Other students came from areas where it was much more of a cognitive process, and so that was a real struggle. I mean, how do you take those students that are from those backgrounds where it's so rote, where it's just tell me the right answer, and help them to transition into the kind of critical thinking that we have expectations for with our students.
Yeah, and that is a real challenge. It's easier if you're in a context like the one that you were in, where everybody's kind of in the same boat, and you're trying to move all of them. I mean, it's hard to get them to move, but you can kind of employ intermediate technology, kind of take them a step closer to where you want them to be and then gradually move them to where you want them to be. I think with students coming into our classrooms, and we do get students who come from very different educational cultures in our classrooms, this is something just to be understanding about it, if nothing else, that they may have never had an experience of doing something creative, for example, or having an opinion about something. Well, you don't have opinions. You just find out what the expert said and then repeat what the expert said. You know, it's not allowed to have an opinion, you know, kind of thing. I had that with my students in Russia initially.
And if I can just say, so that, I have noticed, I teach a grad class with lots of international students. And because of that very fact, there's a very different understanding of plagiarism. There's a
Yes.
sense that I'm honoring somebody by using their words.
That's right, yeah.
Instead of realizing, no.
Yeah, and that is a huge issue with international students from all over the world. I mean, China and Korea certainly, but Russia as well. It's just, I had a teacher who was working with me in Moscow, and she was doing a master's program while she was teaching English at Moscow State University, and her professor told her in a class of 30 people she was the only person who wrote her paper and didn't just copy it from the internet. And I mean, so it's just so universal. And so, yeah, there are different values underlying that, like this focus on tradition and, you know, that kind of thing. But I think, so, I mean, like my response to that would be, if you're in a classroom and you have a student who plagiarizes a paper for you and they're early in their years here at Lee, then I would see that as a learning opportunity and not as a moment to, you know, start proceedings to kick them out of the university. And, you know, walk them through it, but make sure they understand just how serious it is and that it isn't an acceptable thing and it is something that could get them kicked out of the university. They need to know that. But they also need help to understand why it is that we see that so differently. And sometimes, you know, my experience has takes people some time to get past that. I taught a graduate level ESL class, for writing class, when I was a grad student at the University of Illinois. And we were required for our first unit to do like a 3-week unit on plagiarism. And I can't even tell you how many times my students plagiarized articles that I had given them in their paper about plagiarism. It was just unbelievable. So you think, okay, I know I explained this, but I said it 50 times, but they didn't get it. So it's a real one of these mental block kinds of issues. They just can't see how you see it differently. Yeah.
I was going to say, when I've taught composition English, the ultimate one, I don't find it international students are really that out of it compared
Great.
to, like if I say, well, we're talking about description and I hand them some kind of narrative and I say, find 3 interesting words and tell me why they're interesting. The Americans have just as much problem with that as the international students.
Yeah.
I mean, it's that kind of critical thinking is just, doesn't seem to be normal. I think it's a generational thing.
Yeah.
That brings a point when you say that, because I'm sitting here thinking, I'm always the devil's advocate here. When you're thinking about giving your international students extra time or giving them, okay, so you've plagiarized, let me talk to you about plagiarism, I'm going to give you a second chance to write your paper. What about that English American student that, you know, no, I know you went through school in the United States and you know what plagiarism is, but they get a second chance because they're an international student and you don't get a second chance.
Well, I don't know that I would handle them differently, honestly. This is maybe revealing more than I should in front of powers that be, but turn off the recording. No. But I mean, I think generally, if you're dealing with new students, if I have somebody who's, you know, been a student for several years already, they know very well what plagiarism is, and they are just really trying to get through, then I'm going to respond to it differently than if they're a freshman, and it's possible that they just really don't understand something. So that would be with Americans or international students. But I think you're going to find and I mean, like, it's not like they get off the hook. They have to write a completely new paper, and usually after the deadline, so they're really under a lot of pressure. You know, it's, I don't know. You had a comment, Carolyn.
Well, I was going to say, we had a group of history teachers that were doing a master's degree here on scholarship through a grant, and they were employed high school history teachers, and they cheated on their papers. I mean, they plagiarized. So we're thinking, well, okay, these are the teachers, and they know we know. So what are they teaching their students? So I think I do think, and it's based on a different value system. I know my Chinese students just don't understand why you want to claim words as your own. If you put them out there, they belong to everybody, and you should be honored, as she said. So it's just a whole different value system, but I don't think our students are necessarily taught plagiarism is a sin. So I would agree with David. I would give them all another chance. If they do it, I give them all another chance. Give them the benefit of the doubt. And maybe they just wanted to see if they could get away with it, and then you let them know they didn't. But you don't cut their head off the first time.
I had two students who plagiarized last semester, and I just copied and pasted the phrases into Google, and there they were. And one of them was just like, "Oh, Dr. Blake, I just knew it. I knew it wasn't right," and that was one case. And then the other person just legitimately didn't know how to work with sources, and I had to work with both differently. But
I was going to say too, it's a pretty high level skill to find a research article and read it and understand it and put it into your own words. I mean, there are a lot of native speakers who can't do that very well, especially as freshmen. And for non-native speakers, it's really hard, really hard.
Yeah.
Linda, I was going to jump back on what you asked about rote, in dealing with them. I've been thinking through all of this, how much the flipped classroom could benefit, working with our students. And I'm trying to flip my classrooms right now. But if we make the outside of class time, that time where they get the lecture, the podcast of, that lecture material, and then we make in class more the application and working together and creative ideas. I think as we flip classrooms, we can accommodate both. I don't know what the rest of you think, but to me it seems like it gives them multiple chances to get information through that, just listening and writing and then working together. So, just a thought.
And the lecture outside of class gives them the opportunity to re-listen.
Exactly.
Slow it down, pause it, process.
So yeah, I think it's a good way to address both.
I also think in American education, we throw out rote learning as if it were a bad thing.
Yeah, it's not.
And it's not an entirely bad thing. You know what, your whole education built on that, but Chinese students can memorize, so use that. I mean, they'll memorize the whole book for you if you want them to. So use that. Memorization can be a good basis for something else. So let it build on the skills they have.
I had a Chinese friend who memorized the entire dictionary, Oxford Dictionary, to prepare for the GRE, and I found it out when I was introducing him to my dad. He's like, "Oh, Donald, son of light." Right? How did you know Donald meant son of light? He goes sheepishly while I memorized the dictionary to study for the GRE. But it was like there on page 672, second word down. It was in his, or probably, page 50 or D, right? But anyway, he had it memorized.
Are we out of time, or do we have time for another?
Ben, you had more.
And this kind of goes back to the different levels of English. And so, me speaking to a Nigerian, we both speak English, but they don't speak the English I'm used to, and I don't speak the English that they're used to. But there's no other language that they have, and there's no other language I have. How do we break those barriers to where it's an effective communication tool beyond just the hi, hello, how are you? It's caused problems for me, especially in the sciences, where I don't know a different word because there isn't one. I have to use the accurate.
They have to learn it,
Yeah, and they have to learn it, but I can't, with native English speakers, I can explain using an analogy, or I say native English speakers in my ignorance, right? With native, with
American English speakers.
Our concentric inner circle of appropriate British origin English. This I can explain in an analogy that might work for somebody who grew up speaking English in America that would not work for somebody who grew up speaking English in India or Nigeria. Do you have any tips on how to, or is it just bring them to your office and sit there for an hour with them and explain it? Does that go back to point number one of just make sure that they know that your office hours mean something to you and to them?
Well, I think there's that, but I think it's also, if you spend some time interacting with them, it may end up being something that's not just an investment in your relationship with that particular student. It may end up being something that helps you then to understand Nigerian English better. Because most people, this is not true with everybody. There are people I have found who just seem like they can't understand any any different accent at all, and they just, I don't know if it's a mental thing or what, but they just can't get over it. But most people, if you have some exposure to a different variety of English, you quickly begin to figure out the strategies you need to use in order to interpret what they're saying. And so I think that's a useful thing for us to do, even if you have to just look up YouTube videos in Nigerian English and listen to some people speak for a little while, you know.
Yeah.
But I mean, ultimately, I think it's going to come down to them and you having to kind of negotiate how you can help one another.
Because you're talking about pronunciation, is that right? Like,
Yeah, pronunciation, and then also one of the things that really causes problems is volume levels. They respond
yeah.
2 or 3 notches below what I can hear.
Yeah.
It's,
Well, and to go along with that, I had a student from Nigeria, and she always sat on the very back row, and you've got the computer on, and you've got the projector on, and I'm up front. So if she asked me a question, I would feel my own anxiety level just go out the wazoo, because first of all, I couldn't hear a word she said.
Yeah.
So I would walk to the back, and I did not want to make her feel like she stood out or make her embarrassed in any way, and yet I can't understand her. So I would ask her to repeat it, and especially sometimes with the words, I'm trying to figure out, okay, all this while she's talking, I'm thinking in the context of what was just up there, what could she possibly be asking me?
Yeah.
And I can feel myself just break out in a sweat and trying to keep her at ease.
Yeah.
And it was a real problem,
Yeah.
but not with all the students, but along with that, I mean, there can also be, I'm from East Tennessee, I went to Middle Tennessee State, and I remember sitting through a whole month of general chemistry, not having a clue what the professor was talking about. And I kept thinking, I read the chapter, why do I not know what he's talking about? And he called a protein a protein. And he said it really fast, and I was like, what is he saying? And finally, protein, it was a light bulb.
That reminds me, though, what you're saying reminds me of just one other strategy we didn't mention, and that is when one of our students from Nigeria, or wherever they're from, says something in the class, we need to cast that back to the class to make sure, so we say it, or we state their question, so that everybody hears what the question was, and then we can make some adjustments and then ask them, is that right? And then they let us know. But we negotiate with them and become comfortable doing that in a classroom context. Also, if you have another student who gives an answer, we need to be sure that we recast that back to the class for everybody to pick up on that. But we don't have to be afraid of being the mediators. We should be the mediators in class, but never let one student's question sort of be uttered without us giving it back to the class and negotiating like that.
Well, my strategy for dealing with that situation is that I just tell them I'm deaf as a post, and that I can't hear what people are saying. So, and it really is true. I mean, so anyway.
You had a question?
Are we?
Yeah, we're kind of out of time.
Okay.
Sorry.
We'll catch afterwards.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was great being with all of you.
Thank you.
Katie.
Thank you very much.